Christopher Bennett had it all, or at least that's what the world believed. Billion-dollar empire, luxury penthouse overlooking the city, the kind of wealth most
Excuse me,
people
is this
only
seat
dream
taken?
of, and the
No,
kind of
please.
reputation that made business schools chant his name like a legend. But inside Harvard's Grand Sanders Theater, during the day of his MBA graduation, Christopher didn't feel like a success. While hundreds of classmates were surrounded by cheering families, proud parents, and overjoyed siblings, he sat isolated in his custom wheelchair, 3 empty seats beside him like ghosts of the life he once planned. Years earlier, a drunk driver had stolen his future in one reckless night, leaving him paralyzed, and worse, taking the love of his life and his best friend in the same accident. Money had kept his empire alive, but money couldn't bring back the people who once made life worth living. As laughter filled the auditorium, he gripped the armrests of his chair, reminding himself not to break, not to cry, not to show weakness. To the world, he would still appear unshakable, the billionaire who conquered tragedy. But deep inside, Christopher Bennett wasn't celebrating a victory. He was silently drowning in loneliness so heavy it was crushing the air from his lungs. Across campus, Simone Washington rushed into the parking lot with her 5-year-old daughter, Amara, tugging eagerly at her hand. Simone had just come off a long hospital shift, her scrubs wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a hurry, but her spirit determined to show up for her younger sister's graduation. Money was always tight, every dollar carefully stretched between bills, daycare, and her daughter's growing needs. Yet Simone had managed to save enough to celebrate this milestone. Her little girl skipped happily beside her, full of boundless energy and curiosity. As they slipped into the back of the auditorium, Amara's innocent eyes locked on a man sitting completely alone in the front section. She whispered to her mother with the blunt honesty only children have. "Mommy, why is he by himself?" Simone followed her daughter's gaze and noticed the sharply dressed man in a wheelchair, handsome, but carrying a sadness that radiated stronger than any perfume or cologne in the room. She recognized that kind of loneliness. She'd seen it in her patients, the ones with no visitors, no one to hold their hand during the hardest moments. For Simone, kindness wasn't just a value, it was survival. Her own parents had died tragically young, leaving her to raise Amara alone. She knew what it felt like to be unseen. And so, even though her adult caution told her not to approach strangers, her heart told her otherwise. And Amara, with the fearless compassion of a child, decided to break the silence. "Hi," Amara said brightly, planting herself beside the stranger's wheelchair as if she belonged there. "I'm Amara. What's your name?" Christopher blinked, startled by the small voice, and glanced down to find a pair of wide, curious eyes staring back at him. Simone hurried over, flustered, apologizing for her daughter's boldness. But Christopher, instead of brushing them off, introduced himself quietly. "I'm Christopher." What happened next was the kind of simple, honest exchange that disarms even the most guarded heart. Amara asked why he was in a wheelchair, so direct that Simone blushed with embarrassment, yet Christopher didn't flinch. "My legs don't work anymore. I was in an accident a few years ago," he explained gently. "Does it hurt?" Amara pressed, her innocence cutting straight to the truth. "Not anymore," he answered softly. When she asked where his family was, the flicker of pain across his face said more than his words. "They couldn't make it." That was the moment Amara turned to her mother and declared with a wisdom far beyond her years, "Mommy, can we sit with Christopher so he's not alone?" And against every hesitation in her mind, Simone agreed. They filled the empty chairs, unknowingly beginning a bond that would forever change all three of their lives. For the first time in years, Christopher felt like someone saw him. Not the billionaire, not the success story, but the man who desperately needed connection. From that point on, the ceremony transformed for Christopher. When his name was called, he wheeled across the stage prepared for silence. But instead, Simone and Amara cheered his name louder than anyone else. The applause didn't come from blood relatives or lifelong friends. It came from a stranger in scrubs and her little girl, and yet it felt like the greatest honor he'd ever received. Afterward, when most families hurried out to dinners and celebrations, Christopher hesitated, afraid this fleeting connection would vanish once the crowd dispersed. But before he could retreat back into his empty world, Simone offered congratulations with genuine warmth, and Amara tugged on his hand, insisting she was hungry. For Christopher, loneliness had become routine, but suddenly he found himself making a choice he hadn't dared in years. With a quiet plea in his voice, he asked, "Would you both join me for dinner? My treat." Simone's instincts told her to decline. She'd been burned before, abandoned by a man who didn't want the responsibility of fatherhood. But the look in Christopher's eyes wasn't arrogance or pity, it was longing. So she said yes. That night, inside a modest pizza restaurant near campus, Simone watched her daughter rearrange the salt and pepper shakers while Christopher helped with a laugh that sounded rusty but real. The billionaire who once lived in silence was rediscovering laughter over pizza and purple crayons. And Simone, for the first time in years, allowed herself to feel the possibility of hope. What began as one dinner grew into weeks of unexpected companionship. Christopher sent a thank you message after the graduation, then invited them to a children's museum when he learned Amara loved dinosaurs, and later to the aquarium where he listened to the little girl chatter about sharks and sea turtles as if her words were precious gems. Simone remained cautious. Her experiences had taught her to distrust men who promised too much too quickly. Yet Christopher never treated their time as an obligation or a performance. He didn't flaunt his wealth, didn't try to dazzle Simone with extravagance. Instead, he showed up consistently, asking about Amara's drawings, letting her climb on his wheelchair like it was a roller coaster, and listening to her questions with the kind of patience that most adults forgot how to have. One afternoon, while Simone pushed Amara on the swings, Christopher opened up about his accident, the fiancé he'd lost, the best friend taken, the guilt that haunted him more than the paralysis ever could. Simone reached over and squeezed his hand, not with pity but with understanding. Later, she revealed Amara's own struggle, a heart condition requiring surgery they couldn't fully afford. The weight of her quiet confession hit Christopher harder than any corporate crisis ever had. Here was a woman giving everything she had to save her child, while he sat on more wealth than he could ever spend. And in that moment, he made a vow, not as a businessman, but as a man who had finally found people worth fighting for. Within days, Christopher moved mountains to cover Amara's surgery, despite Simone's protests. She didn't want charity, didn't want to be seen as someone who took advantage, but Christopher wouldn't take no for an answer. "Every child deserves a chance to run and play without pain," he told her, his voice steady. "Let me give her that chance." When the day of surgery arrived, he was there before dawn, coffee in hand, pacing the waiting room until the surgeon returned with news. The operation was a complete success. Simone collapsed into tears of relief, and Christopher, who hadn't prayed in years, felt his heart awaken in gratitude. From that day forward, he was a constant presence during Amara's recovery. He brought puzzles, read stories, and transformed scary hospital nights into laughter-filled adventures. And as Amara healed, something else healed too, the broken pieces of Christopher's soul. Simone began to see a different side of him, not the billionaire on magazine covers, but a man who cried quietly when Amara slept, a man who cherished simple things like holding her hand, a man who was rediscovering joy through love. By the time Amara declared one night, "Christopher should live with us because he's happiest when he's here," Simone couldn't deny the truth. Christopher wasn't just helping her daughter survive. He was helping them all live again. But love stories, especially real ones, are never without tests. Christopher's estranged family reappeared, questioning Simone's intentions, poisoning him with doubts. Was she after his money? Was she playing the role of selfless caregiver while secretly planning a secure future? The words ate at him until one night he let the poison slip, accusing Simone of what she feared most, that he saw her as someone who wanted his fortune, not his heart. Her face crumbled and she walked away, leaving the engagement ring behind. For weeks, Christopher lived in torment, realizing he had let the wrong voices dictate his truth. Finally, with the help of his therapist, he confronted his mistake and began making amends not with gifts but with actions. Anonymous donations to the hospital, scholarships for single mothers in nursing, and a heartfelt letter delivered through Amara. In it, he admitted his failures, acknowledged his fears, and promised to love them not as symbols of healing, but as his family. When Simone finally called, her words were cautious but open. "I need to know you'll never doubt me again." And Christopher, humbled to his core, told her the truth. "I know who you are now. You're the person who gave me back life." This time there were no conditions, no hesitation. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt trust, proving that love wasn't about perfection, but about choosing each other even after mistakes. 6 months later, in a chapel filled not with grandeur but with genuine joy, Christopher Bennett married Simone Washington, with little Amara proudly carrying the rings and declaring him her daddy before the vows were even spoken. It was a wedding defined not by wealth, but by love, surrounded by friends, nurses, and neighbors who had witnessed their journey. Christopher even surprised everyone by kneeling, despite the pain, to ask Amara directly if he could be her father forever. And when she leapt into his arms, shouting yes, the entire room wept. That evening, as music filled the reception and laughter echoed, Christopher realized the greatest miracle wasn't in the billions he had built, but in the family he had found. Months later, doctors told him there was hope he might walk again, but by then he already knew the truth. The most important healing had already happened in his heart. From the man who once sat surrounded by empty chairs at graduation to the husband and father now cheered on by two people who loved him unconditionally, Christopher Bennett had discovered the only wealth that truly mattered. And as you reflect on his journey, ask yourself, isn't love, trust, and family the real definition of success? If this story touched your heart, make sure you subscribe right now, because more life-changing stories are coming that will remind you of the power of second chances, the strength of love, and the beauty of never giving up on hope.